I get the recording going. I'll probably be letting people into the class for a couple of minutes, but all right. Yeah. So, hello, everyone. Welcome. Philosophy of Religion. Hopefully, that's what you're all here for. Hopefully, everything went right in that regard, at least. So, my name is Dr. Paul Dorado. I'll be your instructor for this semester. Feel free to call me whatever you'd like. Paul, Dr. Dorado, professor, instructor, whatever. Don't really care. What we'll do today, because I know these remote classes can be a bit iffy, a bit hard to sort of sit through in some regards. So what we'll try to do today is real fast, just run through some sort of course formatting stuff, and then actually just dive right into the interesting stuff, actually. What is philosophy of religion? What are we going to talk about? What is this semester actually going to look like? So, and try to have that be, my hope maybe go 40-ish minutes today, I'm guessing. So that, the Zoom format's not too odious, at least. For most of you probably are aware of this, but just in case you aren't. So we've got the CSU's in a bit of an interesting situation to start the semester with. We're not exactly sure when we're going to be allowed to begin any kind of face-to-face instructions. So for at least the first 2 weeks of the semester, we're going to be meeting like this via Zoom. And then also for the last couple weeks of the semester, that will be remote too. After spring break, everything is going to be remote for the rest of the way. In the middle, I don't know exactly starting when, but at some point in the middle at least, we'll shift to a hybrid structure where we'll talk about in a second. I'm going to try to give you a bunch of different options for ways you can sort of be enrolled, take part in the course activities, try to find something that works for everyone, but there'll at least be some face-to-face option available. Fingers crossed, but hopefully at some point at least we will get to that point. Just to real fast do some sort of just basic Zoom etiquette kinds of stuff. I'm starting everyone off as muted just so there's no feedback or anything, but you all should have the ability to unmute yourselves and feel free to do so at your convenience. I really want to try and have this as much as we can at least mimic what a normal class session would look like. So if you've got a question, a thought, a comment, something you want to say, do it. You can send something through the chat to me. You can do a little hand raise. You can just unmute yourself even and say something. That's fine too. So yeah, don't hesitate to do that. It'll be way more interesting for everyone if it's not just me talking all the time, me included. It'll be far more interesting if other people are getting involved too. So let's talk a little about the beginning part, the remote part of the course is going to look like. We're just going to meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays like we normally would. So that'll be the plan there. We'll start, I have a reading for you all on Thursday. We'll start doing the reading, talking about the reading, going through stuff in that format. So normal, not surprising, not unexpected. Once things go to a hybrid structure, things are going to get more interesting. So the way it's going to work, I'm going to divide you into groups of 2, not surprising there. One half of the class will be sort of scheduled to come in on Tuesdays, and the other half of the class will be scheduled to come in on Thursdays for face-to-face instruction. But the other half will be live streaming the class using the built-in Echo 360 functionality of Canvas. So that way, everyone will be there every day, but not everyone will be physically there every day. Half the class will be physically present on Tuesday, the other half will be physically present on Thursdays. If you prefer, you have the option to just do the whole thing remote, to not come in at all. I know some people need to do that for health reasons. Other people might need to do that for preference reasons, and that's fine. And again, I'll be recording the Zoom sessions that we're doing when we're doing remote stuff. And also when we're doing the face-to-face stuff, there'll be recordings on Echo 360 of all the class sessions as well. So if you have to miss something either for illness or just because you need to take the course in an asynchronous fashion, you'll have that option too, even when we're going remotely. So my hope is that you'll all have a lot of options. I'll probably send out a survey within a couple days or so, trying to get a sense of what people will want to be doing during the hybrid portion. If enough people want to do it fully remotely, maybe everyone who wants to do face-to-face can go in every day. because I basically just have to, I can only have half of you in the room at a time, but if only half of you want to be in a room at a time, perfect. Then we could, everyone who wants to can do face-to-face, everyone else can do remote. So I'll try to keep you updated on what I'm seeing from people as a result of these surveys, the way people want to sort of run things. But my hope is that there'll be a lot of options for people to find something that works for them. And I'm also going to try to arrange it. I've got some technological things in the works so that even if you're sort of doing the live streaming of the class, you'll still be able to sort of participate remotely via something, maybe even something like Zoom, where you'll be able to send me chat questions, maybe even show up as video to like take part in the classroom discussion in that format too. So I don't know when the hybrid face-to-face stuff will start, but that's at least what it will look like when / if we're able to move to that modality. So stop right now for a second. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, or comments, or anything about what the course structure will look like?
Mildly curious. I have some questions about discussion portions of things. And I'm sorry, my brain's a little fried. I have 3 classes all back to back on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Me too.
You know how it feels, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in the class too. So if we do this asynchronistically, is there like a discussion board type thing that we can participate in that way? Yes. Or do we need to, is that how we're kind of doing it, a mixture of if we're live streaming it, or 2, if we're live streaming it, how should we, if we've got questions, how do we go about all that?
If you're live streaming it, so if you're doing the live streaming, again, the precise program I'm not sure about yet, but the basic ideas will look pretty similar to Canvas actually. And you'll be able to send me questions at the very minimum via chat. Okay. And you also might be able to do it via video too. I'm not sure if I can make that work with the tech, but maybe even that way too. So you'll just basically like show up on the monitor asking a question.
Okay, all right.
If you're doing it asynchronously, then yeah, there will be a class discussion board on Canvas that I'll open up probably next week again, that people can contribute to, whether they're asynchronous or not, but the people who are doing it asynchronously can be involved in that way. And discussion stuff won't be graded or anything like that. So it'll just be if you want to be involved in the discussion.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Anyone else? If you're curious, this is what's called a HyFlex. That's what I'm trying to do. I got feedback from a bunch of students saying that they hated the straight hybrid stuff. So I'm trying to come up with some way of not having to do the straight hybrid stuff, give you all a bunch of options, and we'll see if it works. It's trying something new, so that we probably will indeed run into some issues throughout the semester, but we'll just try to adjust and be flexible as things sort of come at us. All right, so let's talk now just briefly about what the sort of grading requirements and the course requirements are going to be. It's pretty straightforward. There's actually really only going to be two kinds of assignments. The big thing for this class, you have 1 paper to write, something around 10 pages for the end of the semester. But the thing is, we're going to do a series of drafts throughout the semester, sort of building up to it. So there'll be a 10-page paper that you turn in at the end of the semester, but maybe at the start, maybe there's a 2- or 3-page paper that you start with the topic, and then I'll give you feedback, then maybe a 5-page one that I'll give you feedback on, so that by the time you get to the end of the semester, you've gotten a lot of feedback from me, and we've got things developed in a sort of an interesting way. That collectively, all of those various drafts and then the final paper will be worth 60% of the total grade. And I can tell you what the question is going to be right now, because it's the question we're going to start talking about in 5 minutes once we get done with the boring stuff. The question is going to be, what does it mean to be, what is a religion, or what would it mean to be religious? That's the question. So we'll probably, the first draft will probably be maybe like middle of February or something like that. So when we get a little bit closer, we'll go into a little bit more details with that. But that'll be most of the grade in the class will be coming from the paper. The remaining 40% of the grades are going to come from daily assignments that'll be due most days, not every day, but most of the days at least. The daily assignments are actually really straightforward, really simple, and they should not take you long to do. They're supposed to be 2 sentences long. And I mean it, 2 sentences long. Don't write me a paragraph. I have to grade these. Short 2 sentences. Sentence number 1, for the reading that you had to do that day, what was the author's thesis? And again, there's more than one answer. There's more than one things usually be argued for. So just identify one of them. Second sentence, what's one piece of evidence or one reason the author gives in defense of that thesis? And that's it. It's basically something to help orient your reading. Because a lot of the time when you're reading philosophy stuff, it can be hard to know what to take from it. So this will sort of help you. You're looking for some central claim, and you're looking for evidence for that claim. So those will be turned in through Canvas before class session starts. So say like we're not going to do one on Thursday, but on Thursday, I'm going to have you read a short piece by a religious historian. So if we were to have a daily assignment, you would write 2 sentences about that piece and turn it in before Thursday's class. We'll start these next week, so you don't have to worry about them right away. And that's it for the grading. So that'll be those 2 things collectively will be your grade in the class. And the purpose of the daily assignments, again, it's just to sort of help orient you a little bit. Students have sometimes told me that they found it helpful to have something to be thinking about when they're doing some of these readings. And we're going to do some serious readings throughout the semester. So hopefully it will be helpful in that regard. And, when I'm making you read Kierkegaard or whatever, I'll keep in mind that it's a difficult reading, and that'll be built into how I grade them a little bit. I'm mainly just looking for are you getting the readings more or less correctly? That's how they'll be graded. All right. That's pretty much all I have for class structure stuff. Again, does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments about any of that? All right, then let's start doing the fun stuff. Enough of this boring business. Get rid of that. Let's get to the interesting things. What are we going to be doing in this class? What is philosophy of religion? All right. So a lot of you are either philosophy majors or have taken philosophy classes before. I saw from the class roster, which is excellent. It's okay if you haven't. That's fine. I'm not assuming you have any background philosophy knowledge necessarily. You'll get some background philosophy knowledge by the time we're done. Don't worry about that. What we're going to be concerned with this semester, like you would in any philosophy of class, is what is this basic phenomenon or concept that we're going to be talking about? So religion. What is this thing? Right? If you're going to do this Socrates, the what is it question, right? What is this religion thing that we're talking about? In the course of answering that question, we're going to talk about a lot of other things, right? A lot of other issues are going to emerge in the course of it. Questions like, for example, what would God, what could such a word possibly refer to? What does that word mean? Questions about what are different kinds of epistemic states? Like if people talk about faith maybe as being some distinctive feature of religion. Okay, what epistemic state is that? What kind of epistemic status does such a thing have? How does religion relate to other things? Natural science maybe, politics maybe, yada, yada, yada. But our central question, the thing we're going to use to guide and orient the whole class is this, okay, what is a religion in the first place? Question. My guess is superficially you're thinking, well, that's weird. How are we going to have a whole class about that topic? That doesn't seem like a hard topic, and it seems like that's easy to answer. So let me give you some initial framing for why I think this question is actually so interesting, because I actually am not sure what I think the answer to this question is. I've got an answer. You'll guess what it is by the end of the semester, but I don't think this is at all an easy question. So here are 3 things that might at least give us some initial pause. So there are some Islamic theologians who have argued within the last 20 or so years that what we would call secularism, or liberal democracy, the idea of sort of church-state separation, that religion is a private matter, not a political one, but your idea, I imagine you're all familiar with to some extent. There have been some Islamic theologians who have argued that that itself is a religion. And not only that it is anti-Islamic. And so to say Islamic states should have secular, liberal, democratic governments is to deny that Islam is true. Now, that might well seem counterintuitive on first blush, because precisely what the claim of the secularist wants to do is to separate religion from political life. But the claim of these theologians is doing that is already a particular understanding of religion, namely a Protestant one, a Protestant Christian one, and one that is just not compatible with how Islam understands the relationship between itself and the political. Okay. So that's one initial thing that might give us pause. Here's another one. In the last, again, 30, 40 years, a bunch of Christian thinkers, and also, interestingly, some postmodern atheists, in an interesting alliance between the two, both of those sides have argued that what you could call scientism, the view that natural science is the only acceptable explanation for events in the world. They have argued that that is itself a religion, not a philosophical position and not an a-religious position. It is instead a different religion or another religion. And again, curiously, it's not just Christian sources saying this. Postmodern atheists have also made this argument. Right. Okay, let's do one more. The Church of Satan. For those of you who are familiar with it, it is a explicitly atheist organization. It denies the existence of gods. They don't actually worship Satan. That would be something else. They're sort of just trying to like make Christians angry by calling themselves it. But nevertheless, they're an atheist organization. They're basically Epicureans, if any of you know anything from ancient Greek philosophy. They're basically like sort of radical Epicureans. But they argue that they are a religion, despite the fact that they are atheistic and hate all religions. Nevertheless, they call themselves a religion. These three should make us almost just confused, right? Because I'm guessing that's not, probably most of you probably wouldn't have wanted to have said any of those three things. Now, I'm not saying that any of those three are right either, but it's at least to start with, we've got people making some what should be surprising claims about what counts or does not count as a religious claim. A lot of things that seem like maybe they're scientific claims in the case of scientism, that seem like they're political claims in the case of secular liberal democracy, right, are being called indeed religious claims. We can make this weirder, and I'll do more with this next class period. So this word religion in English, so it's an English word, right? It comes from the 10th century or so. That's around when it starts being used. And it does not mean when it's first used anything like anything you mean by it. A religious person in the 10th century was not a Christian. A religious person was a monk, someone who took a monastic vow. And so the distinction that would have been drawn in the 10th century was between people who were religious, people who were monks, people who took sacred vows of, say, poverty or vows of chastity, and people who are still Christians, but who are not religious. It's not that they did not take vows. They lived a normal life where they got married and worked and had kids and fought in wars and yada, yada, yada. That's also pretty weird. That's also different. And we can make it even worse. There is actually no word in Islam or Hindi. So I think almost all of you would want to say Islam is a religion, Buddhism is a religion, Hinduism is a religion, Jainism is a religion. There is no word in either language that even remotely translates to the English religion. There are some that are similar, and we'll talk about this next class here. But like din is similar in Arabic, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And the difference is indeed important. It seems to mean something more than the word religion means in English. Maybe it's gonna be hard to figure out how to talk about a lot of this, because at least I'm gonna teach the class in English, so we're gonna be sort of stuck with some of the English words. But there's a whole bunch of really bewildering things that emerge once we start poking at this idea of religion. A whole bunch of stuff that we seem to all agree should belong as a religion. It's not going to be clear why. And a whole bunch of stuff we all seem to agree shouldn't fit. It's not going to be clear why it shouldn't either. So let's do some examples. And then I want to turn to some more discussion stuff in just a second. But let's do a few more examples just to set all this up. What are some things that we would all agree are religions? Let's go to the screen. Let's go to the whiteboard for a second. All right, I take it more or less everyone would agree that the Hebraic tradition is a religion. Right, so what do I mean by Hebraic tradition? We can go with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism. which there are still Zoroastrians, not many, but there are still indeed some Zoroastrians. I think all of you would start with like, yeah, that sounds right. My guess is almost all of you would want to add to this many of the traditions that began in India are religions. So Hinduism and Buddhism, they seem to also be religions. Most people, again, I take it I'd have nearly unanimous agreement, except curiously from some Buddhists who will argue that Buddhism is not a religion. But we'll take it. That's at the end of the semester. We'll get there. But we'll get there eventually. We're going to start in the West and then move to non-Western cultures as the semester progresses. That's going to be the trajectory. So, but most of you at least would have said Buddhism is a religion coming in. No problems. And again, I also imagine almost all of you would have said that things like the ancient Egyptian, ancient Greek, ancient Roman, ancient Norse, what you could loosely call pagan traditions, are religions. Maybe we could add to this maybe some of the Native American traditions. Again, I'm just group all this together in the heading pagan. Again, we'll talk a lot about what that word pagan means. Again, that's another one where things get weird. Maybe some of the African traditions, some of the shamanistic traditions in Siberia. Perhaps. Again, I imagine you would all be tempted to say that these count as religions. Again, we can label all these with the word pagan. All right. Interestingly, there is no word in any of these languages that, again, even remotely corresponds to the word religion. The ancient Greeks, which is my specialty is ancient Greek stuff, they had no such word and would not have described them, would have probably been confused if you tried to tell them that they had a religion. They would have found that, they wouldn't be clear what it was you were attributing to them. But okay, we would all group these. I think we're all comfortable with these, I think. All right, let's get to some that are a little bit iffier, fuzzier. What about things like Confucianism or Taoism, some of the Chinese traditions? Here, I think we run into areas where people would be maybe a little bit more cautious. Probably Taoism people would be closer to, people would be more likely to want to call that the Tao some kind of something analogous maybe to the Christian God or something, and so you can assign it a similar place. But Confucianism seems more like just straightforwardly a political philosophy of governance or something. It does have talk of gods in it, talk of piety to the gods in it, but it's seemingly at least different in its orientation than how we would want to talk about many of these other things. All right. So maybe here we have one that's a little bit questionable, but still probably, like if you took a world religion class, you would probably study these in your world religion class. Let's get to ones that probably many of you would actually want to strongly say, no, these don't seem to be religions. How about Scientology? My guess is at least many of you would want to say, no, Scientology is not a religion. Or things that we would be tempted to call cults. Are cults religion? Like, there's the Seventh Gate cult, right? Which people who thought aliens were going to come and sort of abduct them and take them into sort of like a life free of the human suffering. Right? What does a cult even mean, by the way? It's actually a good place to pause here for a second. What is a cult? What does that word even mean? Any of you have any ideas?
I personally, I'm inclined to group cults in as a religion. Mm-hmm. Personally, I think that, and this is one of the reasons why I do think, oh gosh, where do I even start with this? Okay, let me reframe. I think that if a religious or a spirit, if we take an ideology, mm-hmm. and we put a very human element into the structure of it, if you were to extract the human element and the human run component of the religion, would you still have like a standalone entity of beliefs and
So something
ideologies.
something almost like sort of abstracted from the ideology, and that sort of like almost like a function of like a charismatic leader of some sort. That could,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
okay.
think that
That's plausible.
yeah. So to me, cults do kind of fit into that religious mindset, because I think there oftentimes, I've talked to people and they're like, well, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious.
Yeah, we're coming. Hold that thought, because we're gonna get the spiritual, not religious, in just a second.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah. So you can probably imagine where I'm going with that. So yeah, I'll bite my tongue for now. But
Okay.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's I think infrequently in terms of how it's sort of like legally defined in the United States, at least, I think that what you're pointing toward is actually a big part of the legal definition. It's something driven by a charismatic leader of some sort. The actual technical definition of a cult, is the idea that it goes back to ancient, again, one of those things goes back to ancient Greece. A cult is something that has secret teachings that are not shared with the public. That's the technical usage of it. And
yeah.
so there were Greek mystery cults, they were called where basically like there would be these like secret rituals that people would do to like attain some kind of immortality or something like that, that were sort of separate from the sort of religious quote unquote practice that people in mainstream life were doing. Usually were things done by elites. So one feature, at least, so why Scientology actually often gets classed as a cult is actually for that reason, because Scientology has sort of secret teachings that are reserved for higher level practitioners. All right, now let's go to, though, as Brittany just brought out, spiritual, not religious. Are spiritual people religious? Well, they precisely are saying spiritual but not religious, drawing some kind of distinction between their spiritual practice and the religious one. What is the distinction? We'll talk about that as the semester goes along, because indeed it's going to be tricky to place what's different between spiritual but not religious people. And then let's get really wacky with it. What about communism? I mean here by this like Stalinism. To me, people throw that word around. I mean like Stalinism or like Leninism or Trotskyism or something like that. Is that a religion? It has many of the trappings of something like Christianity. It has highly ritualized practice. It doesn't have veneration necessarily, but it does have the idea of the sort of like dialectical progression of material history. That's something seemingly kind of supernaturally seeming that's supposed to be guiding the flow of things. Would we be tempted to call that as a religion? And indeed, if I'm going to go there, why not just say atheism itself? Is atheism itself a religion at that point? All right, so one way you could think about what we're going to talk about in this class is almost as if we're just trying to like define a word, right? As if there's this word religion that I've raised, and I just want to know like which of these things should I include within it. That's actually not the most interesting way of thinking about this question, I don't think, though. So I'm going to continually almost try to push against the defining words understanding. Like a really good dictionary definition is not going to satisfy me, I think. Because like what I'm looking for isn't to define the word religion. I want to know what phenomenon in the world we're pointing toward when we call something religious. What are we pointing toward? What are we identifying? And the question that ultimately interests me, are we identifying this phenomenon well? Or are we identifying this phenomenon poorly in a way that's actually going to hinder our ability to be successful human beings in the world? And spoiler alert, I think the latter. I don't think we've done a great job the last 200 years in how we're talking about this thing. And I think it's had real demonstrable harms, actually, in things like politics. The way we've not talked well about not the word, but the phenomenon, right? The phenomenon in the world that people are pointing toward. So, okay, that's my introduction. My hope is at least that you've all have some sense of the question at least now. Let's just try to answer it. Why not? It's the first day of class. Let's just try to answer it. When you think of religion, tell me what you think of. We'll just make a chart, or not even a chart, just a list. What do you think of when you think of religion?
I would say two primary features come to mind.
Okay.
One would be some sort of like metaphysical structuring of reality or of the world, and the other would be specific ritualistic practices that are aimed in some way to embody those metaphysics.
Good. Good. So we've got good first idea. I think it's absolutely right. So something we're going to have to talk a lot about. There's some kind of metaphysical account of reality that's being offered. And there are certain ritualized practices that in some sense go along with, embody, I think was the word you used. I like that. That's a good word. Or maybe instantiate or realize that metaphysical system in some sense. One thing we'll have to check real fast, not check, but just keep in mind. Normally we would call something that gives a metaphysical account of reality philosophy. That would be the normal, since philosophy is indeed a part of metaphysics. And indeed, one thing we haven't talked about yet, by the way, is how philosophy relates to religion. But certainly something like a metaphysical account, or what philosophers would at least want to call a metaphysical account, seems like it might be part of it. Good. In the chat, we have someone suggesting that there's a suppression of sort of the individual ego for the sense of something greater. That seems good. That seems like a feature that a lot of people would point toward. Right. And by greater here, what do we mean by this greater? Again, this is something we're gonna have to figure out. But there's something more than me, and this something more than me matters more than me. Maybe we attempted to say. Another person in the chat has suggested that sort of a structure of morality or ethics, and I think that's absolutely right. Okay. Though again, it's important to note, we would normally just call that, again, philosophy, weirdly, because there's ethics is another branch of philosophy, another part of philosophy. Let's see, what else have we got in the chat? We got a relationship to the world around us. That's good. I think that's absolutely right. How do I fit in with the broader universe? So it's going to answer certain kinds of questions, and this certainly being one kind of question. How do I fit in with the universe? So maybe not just mere submission, but maybe in a positive sense, maybe what are my duties as a member of the universe, member of the world in some sense. Good. Let's see, go through just going through the chat. What else have we got? We got some talk of an afterlife. And maybe some way of attaining it, maybe so an afterlife and practices that go along with this belief. Good. Let's see, what else have we got? The idea of a community. Good. Some kind of communal activity here, some kind of communal life that's involved in religion in some sense. Good, good. And let's see, we have one, I think we have, oh yeah, I'm falling behind on the chat, so I'm going to keep going through. I'm going to catch up to you, don't worry. Let's see, we've got, yeah, something about some kind of like healing or salvation. Good. And how we can sort of be bettered. Again, so maybe not just mere submission, but also how we can become better as individuals. Good. Places of worship, some people are bringing up. I think that's absolutely right. I think it goes together with the communal, the idea of community too. That there are these sort of sacred spaces where we worship together, right? And that are different. Maybe, maybe we don't do the rave in the church. Maybe we only do the religious thing in the church. It's just, so that's what we just mean by the sacred. The word sacred literally just means to set off to one side. So like a space that's reserved for the most important things in some sense. Good. We've got someone brought up the idea of mythology, which I think is super important here. And let's mean this word, sometimes the word mythology has a sort of prerogative, a derogative sense. Let's just mean by mythology what the word literally means, just stories. Right? So if I ever talk about Christian mythology, I'm not denying the truth of Christianity. I'm just talking about the stories that are told in Christianity. This is just literally what the word mythos is, just a story in Greek. That's just what the word means. So yeah, just the stories that we might tell as part of our sort of religious practices. And these stories might well relate to all kinds of different things. Maybe they'll relate to ethics. Maybe they relate to this metaphysical thing that we talked about earlier. Someone's added in an idea of a sort of a purpose for life. I think that's super important. And it ties in, I think, with a lot of these other things too. Good. Let's see. I think, yeah, a lot of these we've sort of already said, so I'm just sort of going through them. Yeah, okay, finally someone said it. I was waiting for this word to emerge. God. Yeah, or, no reason to prejudge, I suppose. We say gods, plural. We don't have to make it singular, I suppose, to start with. But yeah, or we could say more generally a higher power. But what people mean by that is God. So yeah, this seems as if it's going to be something that most of the time people seem to mean by religion. And indeed, most philosophy of religion classes are really just philosophy of God classes. They're just, and we'll do some of this stuff, but they're just concerned with actually sort of like proofs for God's existence or non-existence and things of that sort. Certainly in the West, at least, certainly in Western Europe, philosophy of religion classes are oftentimes almost overwhelmingly focused on that particular question. Yeah, we've got, so the idea of a creation story, good. Right? So some kind of account of the beginning of things, right? And that goes together with this idea of mythology, obviously. Many of the mythologies, the stories might be creation stories. Some might be other things. And I think someone added a question in the chat that I think is quite pertinent in this case. When we're talking about an afterlife, we could actually also talk about maybe a prior life. Right? If we have a reincarnation schema, so it doesn't just have to be thought of in the Christian terms. Good. I think I got most of the things that people did in the chat. I think I got most of them have been talked about to some extent. So good. This is a great list. It's a very helpful list. It's a good starting list. Nothing's wrong here. But what I'm hoping we're going to see is that something seems off in the list of things that you all agreed were religions and this list. So let's start here. A metaphysical account of reality. You know who is super opposed to giving metaphysical accounts of reality? Buddhists. Again, we'll have to figure out what we mean by metaphysics, but a frequent critique that I have heard from Buddhist practitioners of Western philosophy is that it's concerned with meaningless metaphysical questions. So now you could say, is that a metaphysics of its own? Maybe, fine. But at the very least, that's not how they're cashing it out. They would not cash out themselves as articulating a metaphysical account of reality. Even if certain branches of Buddhism do indeed feature metaphysical accounts of reality. It's like the Abhidharma and Theravadan Buddhism. But there are at least many Buddhist sects that are going to strongly be opposed to anything like a metaphysical account of reality. And they certainly aren't going to see it as being central to what they do, even if there is one. All right, let's go now to this idea of ritualized practice. Absolutely. If it wasn't for the minor little detail that Protestant Christianity is all about avoiding ritualized practice as much as we possibly can. Again, different sects of Protestant Christianity to greater or lesser extents. But there are indeed some sects of Protestant Christianity that are pretty vehemently opposed to anything resembling ritualized practice. More extremist sects, obviously. But the whole point of Protestantism was precisely to move away from ritual rather than the embracing of it. And again, we might think of also, if you think of Taoism as a religion, the Tao seems to very much be opposed to codified ritualized practice. That's one of its critiques of Confucian practice, indeed, is that it is too engaged in ritual. This question of how do I fit in with the broader universe? Everything that we would be tempted to call a religion, I think, satisfies this, but so does communism, so does atheism, so does naturalism, or the view that the natural world is all there is. A lot of things, at least, that we would have maybe at first blush not been tempted to call religions are doing this too. Okay. Religion is being communal practice in some sense. Again, that's going to, where that seems to run into problems is really with Protestant Christianity. There are many sects of Protestant Christianity that, again, increasingly emphasize the private nature of religious practice, that it's precisely something that's not really done community. Maybe we do it communally as part of our political system or something, but that indeed are best done through individualized, personalized practice. So highlight this one. I mean, I think we're going to have a hard time getting away from this sense of something communal taking place here. But highlighted at least that there are some things, some parts of Christianity that are actually, if not opposed to this, at least pretty ambivalent about the communal structure of religious practice. And again, community, having sacred spaces where we do things together, again, that seems like that fits with communism, with National Socialism, just as readily. I mean, it even seems like it works with like American capitalism or something. Like the Super Bowl is kind of like a ritualized capitalist practice, right? That we all do together and watch the commercials and talk about the commercials. And yeah, I mean, so yeah, depending, this seems like it's going to be unavoidably part of the story we need to tell. And yet it also seems to be really expansive with what this is including. Submission of the ego for something greater. Good. We're going to need to spend a lot of time talking about what we mean about the greater. So for now, I'm just going to flag that as a question. We should really want to know what we mean by this greater thing. But yeah, good for now. System of ethics. Again, that just sounds like philosophy at that point, because lots of philosophies talk about ethics. And you've all probably seen the signs hanging up saying you can be moral without religion or something like that. Right? You can be ethical without God, yada, yada, yada. So at least there's people who are talking as if ethics can be separated from religion. Whether they're right or not, separate question. But again, things that should just make us concerned. There are things that are the religious traditions that deny that there's an afterlife. Actually, early on, the Christians weren't sure that there was an afterlife. In the very early Christian practice, actually, there was some interesting discussions about whether or not that was the case. And indeed, there are certain religions that argue you die and you die. That's kind of seems to be what the Greeks thought. The Greeks, again, it's super ambiguous. The Greeks believe a lot of different things, but there were at least strands of Greek mythology, like Epicureanism, that were like, yeah, the best thing about life is that you die, and then you don't have to keep going. Got a chat question for a second here. Oh, someone's adding in. Yeah, I think this is actually, let me add this in, because actually this is an important one. So I'm going to add a little arrow to this system of ethics thing. Someone just added something in the chat, and it's actually super important. Accounts of family and gender normativity. Yeah, that's sort of connected with this idea of ethics. So sort of like the ethics of family, ethics. But I think it is worth specifying as different, at least to draw attention to it, because probably one of the things a lot of you all think of when you think of religion is very specific accounts of family, of gender, of sexuality, yada, yada, yada. So that's a subset of the ethical thing, but it's worth throwing in, I think. But then again, note weirdly then, so would like liberalism then be a religion? Because liberalism also has an account of family, gender, normativity too, sexual normativity. Postmodernism, Foucault writes nothing but about these topics, and I think Foucault would be very surprised to learn that he was a religious thinker. That's not how he would. Maybe he is, but he wouldn't have thought of himself that way, at the very least. This idea, this teaching is about salvation and healing. I like that someone added this one, because this is going to be one of the few cases where actually I can say Buddhism, but not most other religions. Buddhism and Christianity and maybe Judaism are the only things that are super concerned with this question of salvation. There's elements of it in Islam, but it's not a big deal and it doesn't come up that much. There's elements of it in Hinduism, but again, it's not as big of a deal, really. Christianity and Buddhism, though, are centrally concerned, uniquely concerned, from what I can tell in the history of Western thought, with this idea of attaining a kind of salvation or healing in life. So, again, not to say that it's wrong. Again, it's just to point out just this sort of, some of the oddities and partialities we encounter. Mythology, story about the world. Well, again, we've let the communist in. We've also let in every single nation in the world, because every single nation has stories that it tells, right? George Washington chopping down the apple tree. By the way, that didn't happen. But it's a great story, right? A great sort of founding American myth of the American people, right? Similarly, you might be tempted to call, again, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, the sort of mythology of capitalism. You could maybe do the dialectical progression of history and communism as a sort of mythology. I'm sure Hitler had some insane nonsense mythology thing that he was proposing to for the Nazi state. And indeed, these would be certainly creation stories as well, right? Both how the world was created, but also how our state or our nation was created, how these things came to be. And then God. This is a perfect one to end with. Let's end with this God word. This is the perfect place for us to end for today. What is a God? What does that mean? It seems like this should be really obvious, right? I mean, my guess is there are some of you here who are atheists, and so who explicitly deny that God exists. Surely you know what it is that you're denying the existence of. Someone's adding in the chat, actually a couple people have added, some sense of something higher than human beings. But let's pause for a second. So if we encountered a bunch of super smart aliens with warp drive and teleporters, are they gods? They're higher than humans in the sense of more powerful, at least, than humans. And presumably they'd be more knowledgeable than humans. They would have technologies humans don't have. And I guess, some people actually, I think, would be tempted to call them gods. If you watch the Ridley Scott's movie Prometheus, it's not necessarily a good movie, but it's a very interesting movie, at least. He does seem to think that if there were super smart aliens, they would be gods. Right? Or maybe the Arthur C. Clarke line that any sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable to us from magic or divinity, something like that, maybe. But at the very least, that's not the kind of God that the Christians are talking about, certainly, right? The super intelligent aliens, they wouldn't be a problem for the Christians anyway, right? They wouldn't bother Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus.
Yeah,
go ahead.
There might be a better way to say higher power is, I think, usually what we mean is like an ontologically more primary thing.
Yeah. Good. Maybe we can mean some kind of ontological distinction, right? Not just like more powerful, but like maybe more powerful in kind. Maybe transcendently powerful. It's a word we're going to be talking a lot about, transcendence. That's Charles Taylor's word that he's going to use for this, a transcendent being. Maybe something like that. But again, that just pushes the question back. What do we mean by ontologically prior? What do we mean by transcendent, right? What do we mean by more powerful in kind or more knowledgeable in kind? However we wanted to sort of render something like that. So I think that's a good direction to go, certainly. But again, we should just notice that that's just sort of pushing the question back to other philosophical questions that we would need to answer. And indeed, don't worry, we will try to. We will try to spend a great deal of time with. Some people have suggested it has to, in the chat, that it has to do with the idea of creation. So that a god is something that creates the world, created human beings in some sense. Weirdly, that excludes all the Greek and Roman ones, because they're actually really explicit that there is no creator of the universe in Greek and Roman thought. The particularly ones that gets codified through Greek philosophy with Platonism. And you get sort of these Aristotelian kinds of Greek god practices. The Aristotelian position is very explicitly gods don't create anything, nothing gets created. The universe has always existed, will always exist, and has always existed. But yeah, so this idea of a creator, I think, is going to be useful. But again, we'd have more things we'd need to ask at least. Someone's brought up the idea of time. That by talking about a god, we're talking about something atemporal. I really like that one. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, ironically, time this semester. That's going to be a much larger topic than you might have guessed in a philosophy of religion class. But actually, different ways of conceiving time are very much going to be at play in some of these discussions we're going to have. Some people are bringing up in the chat ideas of things like caring about human beings or sort of laying out sort of a moral ethical order. And that seems plausible compelling again in some respects, but it's going to get a little bit weird because nature in Stoic thought does that. Is nature a god? Well, the Stoics actually think it is, interestingly, but for what it's worth. But again, we might wonder, at least we might have some things that, again, we have, at least at the very least, we have more to say. And then some people are saying actually just a symbol, right? Some sort of like reification of our beliefs in something. Yeah, which I think is going to actually neatly match with actually some of the pagan traditions. Actually, some of the pagan traditions I think do go in that direction. Good. I think there's a hand up as well, Brittany. I think you have a hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm actually not seeing any group chat stuff for whatever reason.
You should have the ability to access it. Oh no, actually, it looks like everyone's just direct messaging me.
You have it set
so
to
I'm not the only
direct
one.
message.
Oh, do I have it set to do that? I thought I set it to do the opposite. But regardless, I think I've tried. So I'll try to figure out. I thought I told it to do the opposite of that, so I'll figure out why it's doing that and get that fixed for the next class. But regardless, at least I think I've actually I think I've said at least most of what I've seen in the chat so far. So
I did still want to kind of add to some of the concepts of what a god or gods are defined as, and I think we can kind of all agree at this point that the definition of what a god or god could be is I think shaped by what the ideology of a particular religion or spiritual structure might be. And I think that, with regards to more Christian ideologies, there's the idea of omnipotence and omniscience. But for me, just some personal background, I guess, on me, I'm a practicing Norse pagan, but I grew up in a Christian household. So for me, my experience of my gods is much more, they're related far more to people, and they're less removed from what it means to be human. And I think that can be sometimes an important, I guess, distinction is, and I think too, how we come to understand what a god is and therefore understand what it means to be human through that. If that, I'm trying to reach at something that's a little ineffable. I don't know. Hopefully that connection makes sense.
I think this is actually really interesting, because I think you were going in actually a slightly different direction, I think usefully and interestingly than some of the other people who have talked so far. There's also, particularly if you're coming from a Christian tradition or from the Hebraic tradition in general, your orientation toward God or gods is going to be very much in terms of their transcendence, the sense in which they're in some sense outside of and therefore the condition of reality. There are indeed certainly pagan traditions that have that as well. What we're going to talk about as the semester goes along as Greco-Roman Neoplatonism also very much goes in that direction. But there are other traditions that see the gods as much more immanent. They get connected, I think, to this idea of God as nature, pantheism, pantheism, where the gods are sort of like present in the world in some sense. Where again, the interesting question that's going to raise then, if the gods are indeed immanent in nature or something like that, does nature just reduce to the gods, or is that what are the gods? Still, what are the gods if that's the case, right? Yeah, but I think that's another important direction that people go. Another thing that I was interesting in what you said that I want to just draw attention to again. If it's the case that different religions are going to define what God means for them, then we can't use God as a definition of what it is to be religious. It's the other way around. Whatever this religion thing is, that would be the thing that's determining gods, not the other way. So if our goal is to define religion, we at least can wonder how well we're going to do with God, if you're right, at least, that the idea of God is something that emerges within religion rather than something that defines the religion. Good. Fiona, I thought I saw you had a hand up, I thought.
Yeah, I kind of forgot everything I was going to say, but I was going to say, like, just in terms of defining what a God is, something that I've noticed in a lot of my other, like, religious, like, studying other religions is, like, some sort of divine entity that understands all, loves all, lives their like plan or whatever through everyone. and through each individual's like human experience
Hmm.
is kind of what I've picked up.
Yeah, good. And that goes really strong in the other direction and towards the God is transcendent. In some sense, that the world is sort of a reflection or an unfolding of the activity of God. You see it strongly, again, and actually in pagan Neoplatonism. You also see it strongly in some Christian traditions, some Islamic traditions, and within Hinduism as well. I mean, Hinduism, you see one of the most stark, but Hinduism is usually what's called a panentheistic religion, where everything is thought of as being some manifestation of God. The true self, the Atman within the Advaita Vedantic tradition, for example, is identical to Brahman, the transcendent God, at the source of all things. Yeah, so good. That's all. That's again, and that's the direction at least that we're going to start the semester with, because we're going to start with Western stuff, and that's where Western stuff in general, particularly Western Christianity, goes very much in those kinds of directions. Good. And then someone in the chat is asking me about how we can relate this to sort of political questions, like things like maybe the question of sort of the establishment of state religions, things like the adding the one nation under God to the Declaration, to the Pledge of Allegiance, things like our money that all has God written on it in various sorts of ways. And yes, we are indeed going to need to talk about the relationship between God and state and religion and state, and those not necessarily being the same thing, but being related things. So yes, there's going to be a lot we're going to have to say, and we're going to have to say it very quickly, actually. We're going to get there Thursday, about how all this stuff we're talking about relates to sort of political communities and political organizations. Chloe, you have a hand up that maybe is to ask a question, or maybe just to ask, so go ahead if you go.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, when it comes to talking about the definition of God, it can kind of be a slippery slope, because there's some religions that, like, I think that Satanism, I'm not sure, I'm not super familiar on it, but they don't like necessarily deny the existence of God, but they like deny the
There's different
worshiping
versions
of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Some
Yeah, so,
versions
like,
of it, certainly.
Yeah, so they don't necessarily deny the existence of God, but they don't look at him or it as like a deity or like something to be worshipped. So is that still like a god in their eyes, or?
Absolutely. That's indeed. What does it mean to call it a god at that point then, if it's not the object that's worthy of veneration? And interestingly, I can tell you what the answer was for the ancient the ancient Epicureans, because the Satanists are similar to the basically sort of Epicureans. It's and the Epicureans' answer is there are things that don't die, and so those are gods. Luckily, they don't care about human beings at all. So why would they? Because we die, and so they'd be really stupid to spend time thinking about us. So you are free from the curse of the priests telling you what to do. Go have fun, go enjoy some pleasure as best you can. And yes, at least there are actually like Satanists in the sense of people who worship Satan. So that's a thing. But the Church of Satan, at least, they go more in the Epicurean direction of not even caring if there are things that don't die, or maybe that satisfy some of these philosophical or metaphysical criteria for God. Just argue that they're not proper objects of veneration and worship. Yeah, so I think that too is one of the options on the table. Good. Yeah, Magnus, go ahead.
So I just have a question about the kinds of gods, or at least like conceptions of God, that we'll talk about in here. Are we only going to be discussing really like positive definitions of God, or will we ever touch on sort of like indefinite sort of, like Kant's God, for example?
Indeed,
just a noumenal thing that we don't know.
Indeed, we will. Well, I don't know if we might not get to Kant's God, actually, but that might be too much of needing to know Kant, which is perhaps outside the scope of this class. But we will certainly we're going to get to at least what are called apophanic traditions that are that worship God by saying what God is not. That God is in himself undefinable, called negative theology, frequently gets called. And that God is in himself undefinable, and instead can only be sort of like negatively talked around by pointing out all the things that God isn't, which is at least ish what Kant is doing. Not exactly as exactly Kant's doing, but it's in the family at least of what Kant is doing.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll definitely again. I mean, I should tell you where I'm coming from with this class. too. You know, I mean, I've told you all my specialization is ancient stuff, and I'm a Neoplatonist. I think we'll talk about what that actually means, but I think Neoplatonism is more or less right. I think Plato more or less gives us a good account of the world. We'll talk a lot about how the account is related to religion, because we're going to read a lot of Islamic Neoplatonists as the semester goes along. Yeah, that's where I'm coming from, and that tradition is all about the negative theology, right? That we can only sort of say what God isn't, not what God is. Yeah, so we definitely will hit that as we sort of advance throughout the semester. Well, also, I hope we'll read some Christian Neoplatonists too, but I'm not sure if we'll have time. We should definitely at least get some St. Augustine, who is a loosely a Neoplatonist. But if we have time, I really would love us to read Dionysius the Areopagite, who's a fascinating thinker, but Eastern Orthodox tradition. Are we going to discuss any of the Hermetic related texts? Someone's asking in the chat. Probably not like in depth, but yeah, we'll at least discuss around them. Some of the Gnostic traditions as well. We'll hit some of them too. Good. All right. So I'm good with ending here for today. We've gone for an hour, which I think is great. I know it can be hard to do much more than that on Zoom. So this seems like this is at least a decent place for us to end. My hope is that we haven't answered anything, but hopefully at least we've gotten some interesting questions. We've got some interesting topics and ideas. What I'd like you to turn to next week, on Thursday, we're just gonna dive pretty much straight into it. There is a very famous religious historian. She's probably the most famous religious historian alive right now, named Karen Armstrong. You might be familiar with her. She's written a lot of books about Christianity, a lot of books about Islam, a lot of interfaith dialogue. She wrote an article for The Guardian in right around 2014, so right around when ISIS was emerging in Syria and northern Iraq, where she wrote an article responding to what she saw as a mistaken understanding of the relationship between religion and politics that is going to be very similar to what Charles Taylor, this is the first book we need, get this book fast. Very similar to what he's going to argue as well, but she says it a lot more straightforwardly and simply than he does. So we're going to start with her saying it in this sort of like popular publication, newspaper article. And then we'll use that to transition right into Taylor's more sophisticated, more philosophical version of making some of the same claims. So if you go to in Canvas, the Canvas page for next class period, you should see an overview of what we'll talk about. There should be a link to the article, and then we won't do any daily assignments or anything like that. So don't worry about that. Just read that article, and that's where we'll start our discussion on Thursday. Any last thoughts, questions, comments? All right, awesome. I'll try to figure out why the group chat's not working and get that fixed for next class period. So thank you for letting me know that it wasn't. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the semester. I think this is a fascinating topic. Hope it will be a lot of fun. And yeah, we'll begin on Thursday. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.